You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 6th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. An end of an era in Canada's politics as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau finally steps down. The influence of Elon Musk takes shape in Europe, and what lies ahead for Ukraine in 2025. I'm Emma Nelson, and the Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and a very warm welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and I'll be joined on the line by our editorial director Tyler Brûlé and Toronto correspondent Thomas Lewis to talk about Justin Trudeau's departure. And my guests Latika Burke and Nick Gowan will be in the studio to talk about the day's big stories, including the news that London is once again the most congested city in Europe. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. And a very warm welcome if you've just tuned in. Let's begin straight away with the news that's broken in the last couple of hours. After 9 years in office, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is bowing out. A little earlier, he spoke to reporters outside his home in Ottawa.
I'm a fighter. Every bone in my body has always told me to fight because I care deeply about Canadians. I care deeply about this country, and I will always be motivated by what is in the best interest of Canadians. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
Well, Monocle's editorial director Tyler Brûlé joins us on the line from our Zurich studios, as does our Toronto correspondent Thomas Lewis. A very warm welcome back to the Daily, gentlemen.
Good evening, Emma.
Thank you very much, Emma.
Tyler, let's begin with you. This is an end of a major era in Canadian politics. As Justin Trudeau just said, he's a fighter, but he has run out of steam.
Indeed, he has. And I was just reflecting and watching the monitors here with the various networks, of course, running, of course, the clips of him, stepping down, standing in front of that microphone, watching also the pages also blow away. There was that sort of moment when you were watching this thinking it was a little bit also like watching Rishi Sunak in that downpour. So I was hoping that he was working with an auto cue or some kind of teleprompter, because it did seem almost a little bit like he was winging it at the beginning. But indeed, as you've said, Emma, and I think as Canadians and certainly those Canadian watchers have been observing for a long time, this is a Prime Minister who definitely ran out of puff, and we've been waiting for a long time. There have been conversations, of course, going on in many corridors and many meeting rooms about when was this actually going to happen. And of course, here we are at sort of the first official start work day of the new year. And I think we've seen the Prime Minister do the right thing, albeit a little bit late.
Thomas, where did it ultimately go so wrong for a Prime Minister whose party won 3 successive elections since 2015?
Well, I think in the more recent past, Emma, you can look to maybe, is it 3 weeks ago now, with that surprise resignation by Chrystia Freeland, who resigned as Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. And it's hard to overstate the storm that really created, I think, given that she had been by Trudeau's side since they first got elected into power back in 2015, and had really been sort of side by side, as I say, with many of the big policies, most notably perhaps the renegotiation of the NAFTA free trade agreement during Donald Trump's first term in office. And I think her resignation letter really was so stinging, kind of really taking aim at some of these last-ditch policies that it felt that Prime Minister Trudeau was sort of throwing at the wall, really, to try and turn some of these stubbornly low approval ratings in the opinion polls that have been present for several months, many months by now. It really felt that that was the start of more and more MPs coming out publicly and talking against him. And I think for many of us watchers, as Tyler alluded to there, I think we've seen Prime Minister Trudeau being a very adept political operator during all his years as Prime Minister. And perhaps there was still a question mark before the news was reported first, I think, in the Globe and Mail, newspaper in the early hours yesterday, that, maybe he would find another card to play this time around too, to take his Liberal Party to another election. That wasn't the case. And I would agree with Tyler. I think that, his statement at the beginning, at least, seemed kind of fairly sad and fairly somber. And I thought it was interesting that he decided to take so many questions from so many reporters. So I think actually did a fairly good job in sort of addressing the wide range of things that, he is now effectively leaving behind as we wait for the process to elect his successor to begin.
Tyler, Trudeau's international image was pretty strong and pretty positive for a very, very long time, wasn't it? I mean, there were some very obvious problems that we had with Canada, not with India. But apart from that, the Trudeau that we saw was someone who could navigate Donald Trump in his first term, who could be internationally very open and conciliatory.
Yeah, I think that there was certainly, in a way, sort of a garden path that was well shoveled and had been salted, and there was a bit of grit on it, and that was that path that, of course, had been sort of laid by his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a gentleman regarded as a great statesman, and of course, sort of a name. You're talking about a dynasty as well. That, of course, many people around the world knew the Trudeau name, of course, from the 70s, and this was, really a statesman who really played to the world stage, someone who was incredibly cosmopolitan. And so here you had Justin, of course, stepping into this role as well. And also in stark contrast, as you mentioned, with Donald Trump. Here you had, of course, already, you could say, an aging, almost sort of, typical of our times, U.S. leader. And then you had this, plucky young gentleman coming to the stage north of the border, and just this youth. And then, of course, seeing, Justin Trudeau show up at his first G7, and there was a bit of swagger, there was excitement, but I think a lot of it was youth, and in and around the same time, of course, a little bit later, we saw Jacinda Ardern sort of rise to the scene. We saw Sanna Marin, of course, emerge in Finland as well. So suddenly you had this, amongst also some, maybe sort of upstanding, highly regarded liberal democracies, there was this, interesting, trio suddenly of very sort of, interesting leaders. However, I think also if we look back at the legacy of Ardern, if we look back at the legacy of Sanna Marin, and I think we can also look back now at the Trudeau years as well, that maybe there was a little bit too much focus on the fashionable sort of policies of the time, and certainly, many of these policies as well, where, of course, we've seen voters in many corners of the world reacting against it, saying, actually, whether you're into identity politics or not doesn't matter. The government of the day has not been thinking about the core things, which is defense. They've not been thinking about infrastructure. They've not been thinking about healthcare. They've been worried about luxury topics. And I think that's going to, I think sort of Justin sort of joins that trio in a way. And I guess I would sort of say it's probably not sort of the best legacy to want to be part of.
So, Thomas, what kind of leader and what kind of government does Canada need now?
Well, I think that's the big question. I think for those within the Liberal Party or within the cabinet even who will be looking to throw their hats into the ring, Emma, I think probably the biggest thing for them that they'll need to surmount is this idea of how much they can distance themselves in voters' minds from Trudeau himself. He is very unpopular, has been unpopular for quite some time. And if you look at some of the names that are already being discussed, for example, Chrystia Freeland herself, she is tied pretty deeply to this near decade of government with Trudeau as Prime Minister. That said, I saw some reporting today that obviously there is a lot of unease about the relationship with the US, with Trump's incoming administration coming and needing a strong figure to be able to manage that relationship and ensure that Canada flourishes as Trump's second term in the White House gets underway. Of course, there are names like Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, of course. He, is reportedly weighing his political options. In Canada, you don't need to be an MP to stand for the leadership, so that would be an option open to him were he decide to do so. But I think the Liberals will now, Trudeau mentioned this in his statement, need to get this process kind of up and underway pretty quickly, because an election has to be held in Canada by October, I believe, this year. So for a new leader to bed in, to try and create the sense of a new set of leadership, that isn't a ton of time to be able to do that, as the Liberal Party has now been in power, have been in power for a decade this year.
And Tyler, finally coming to you, same kind of question. Internationally, what kind of country, what kind of government does Canada now need, especially when we have, 2 weeks away before Trump seizes the reins down the road in Washington?
Well, and not to mention 2 weeks away from Davos as well. And your point about international, Emma, that's just it. I think Canadians do want to see themselves emerge on the international stage to be seen as a player. I think a lot of people question, going back to the G7, should Canada even be part of the G7? Is it enough of a player? It's sort of there by default. And if it is going to be in the G7, then it needs to be part of the global conversation. I think that is what many Canadians are missing. We've seen, of course, a string of not particularly attractive incidents, flare-ups around the world. And Canada, from the position of certainly global affairs, which is Canada's version of the foreign ministry, Canada's just not in the conversation. Maybe that's the key thing. How does Canada emerge and become part of the global conversation? That's one side of it. And then I would go back to just domestically. Pride, a nation to be proud of. And I was talking to someone recently on a trip to Ottawa, and there's this question in Canada: is Canada a nation, or is Canada more of a platform today? It's a place where people bring ideas. Are people that? And it's a question of new Canadians on one side. Are they that invested in the country, or are they there just to get something up and running? Then they retreat and go back home to maybe a place of conflict where they've come from when things emerged. But have they brought anything back with them from Canada? And how invested are you as a Canadian in the nation? And then I think on the other side as well, I was in Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal just a few weeks ago. And my goodness, there is a lot of deep soul searching going on. I mean, if you turn on the national broadcast or other broadcasters, it is a very depressing listen. And this idea of just this notion that everything has to be sort of picked apart. And we know that we're in a period of reckoning in many nations. But you have to look forward, and you have to have a sense of leadership, and it can't be always, this notion of sort of digging deep and sort of scratching at the scabs. And of course, there has to be, and we have had a period of reckoning. But also you have to look forward as well, and you need a leader who can deliver that. And I think people are looking for someone, and there is a big discussion. Is someone like Mark Carney seen as too cosmopolitan, too much international experience? I think that's exactly what Canada needs. Canada needs someone who can go to Washington, someone who can spend time in Brussels, someone who can also fly to Beijing and have a proper conversation. And I think this is the main point. Canada needs someone with... Do people have Rolodexes anymore? I'm not sure. Anyway, someone who's got deep contacts and can pick up the phone and have conversations globally, because Canada has to engage on the international stage.
Tyler and Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on the Monocle Daily. We're listening to that. Latika Burke and Nick Gowing, welcome back to the studio. Happy New Year to you both.
Same to you.
Happy New Year.
Let's just touch on what Tyler was mentioning a moment ago, that we have to examine what kind of country Canada wants to be, and his idea that perhaps it's a nation, perhaps it's merely a platform. Latika, do you want to add on to that?
Yes, I've long been mystified by exactly what Canada does on the world stage, because arguably, and maybe this is being a bit too nativist, you two can absolutely tell me if so, I would think a country like Australia projects more in terms of power, in terms of relationships, in terms of its player status on things like China, and than Canada does. And Canada is arguably at the same stature, if not more. It's in the G7, for example, and Australia is not. So I have long wondered exactly why Canada suffers this deficit in projection, particularly in terms of its soft power. I mean, Canadians are the Americans everyone likes. So I'm not really sure exactly what Canada's agenda has been on the world stage. Very interested to see how they use their G7 chairmanship this year, because I think they're going to try and make a big play about putting the Arctic front and centre of the security conversation, which is a very smart idea. But with this political turmoil, I'm not really sure they can pull it off.
Nick, are we too easily lulled into that trope of Canada lives persistently in the shadow of the United States, as Latika said?
I don't think we're lured at all. I think it's going to be very realistic. And I think what Trump, when he went to the Kananaskis G7 meeting 7 years ago when he was president, just took Trudeau apart. And I think Canada is now regarded by Trump as the 51st state of the United States. And what the reason Chrystia Freeland resigned back on December the 16th is very important to understand. She's very ambitious, ex-Reuters journalist, ex-Foreign Affairs Minister, ex-Deputy Prime Minister, but she was making a statement which is, we cannot go on like this. We're going to have to stand up. And I think it's going to be a bitter, nasty battle.
Let's move on to some of our other subjects on today's Monocle Daily. There will be a sort of an almost accidental theme going through this, which is how the rest of the world is managing to plan when in 2 weeks' time Donald Trump goes back to the White House. And in a little while we'll be talking about the Trump / Elon Musk influence in Europe. But let's have a look at what's happening in Ukraine, because it is a country which has begun its 2025 as it hopes to go on. There's been a surprisingly powerful offensive in the Kursk region. Not immediately clear how much Ukraine has advanced in the region, but this operation comes at a critical point in the nearly 3-year war, at a time when both Moscow and Kyiv are trying to strengthen their hands before Trump comes back to the White House. And Nick, it does beg the question, how much is a lot of this now about Trump's imminent arrival?
Well, it's been worked out. It's been scoped. Many have assumed that Trump will take a certain view. The idea that he's going to solve the war in 24 hours is absurd. Similarly, Zelensky a few weeks ago was talking about a guarantee of victory. There is going to be no guarantee of victory for Ukraine. It's going to be a miserable stalemate, probably, and it'll be enshrined a bit like the Dayton Agreement in Yugoslavia. We're heading for a grim year. Well, we're already in the grim year. And it's all very well talking about advances by Ukrainians in this very cold weather. But in the end, it's minuscule compared to the enormity of what Putin has done. He's seized 20% of Ukraine, and we've got to get that in perspective. Yes, the Ukrainians have had remarkable success in some ways in the Kursk region, taking a significant amount of land. But the Russians are doing very well militarily in some respects, but they are being torn apart, both in terms of the human cost and the physical cost to their machinery and so on. And the North Koreans appear to not be giving much support, suffering enormous numbers of casualties. But the Ukrainians are bleeding badly, certainly in terms of manpower. They do not have enough young people at the front. And we're talking about trench warfare. It's miserable. And I don't hold out much hope at all of anything positive coming from this. And indeed, when this began on the 24th of February, almost 3 years ago, I said this is going to end up as a stalemate. And I fear that's where we're at the moment.
It depends what you mean by something positive. If you wish to bring a conclusion to the war, albeit with some enormous sacrifice being made by Ukraine, the mood at the moment, Latika, is suggesting that the arrival of Donald Trump is pushing people towards some sort of resolution. I mean, we even had the French President Emmanuel Macron saying that, I think in the last couple of hours, that Ukraine needs to adopt a realistic stance on territorial issues. And he's called upon the United States to bring Russia to the table while Europe tries to usher Ukraine to the table.
Yes, I'm a little bit more optimistic than Nick, because I think what Donald Trump's inauguration provides is, let's not even Donald Trump is saying he'll solve the war in 24 hours anymore. Let's put that aside. But it is a signal of intent. And that's what we haven't had. Previously, we have had Europe and America sputtering out all sorts of rhetoric about how we're all standing with Ukraine for however long it takes, but actually tying Ukraine's hands behind its back and not arming them with what it could have taken or needed to win or break through in a decisive manner. So yes, we have a terrible stalemate happening. I think Zelensky's language has shifted a lot, actually. And what all of this is about securing a guarantee, not an assurance, because Ukraine has had assurances before and look what happened. So now Zelensky is trying to set up, I think, a climate where he can say and prove to Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans, it's not me that's your problem, it's Putin that won't come to the table. It's Putin that won't negotiate. It's not me. I think he has started that work, and I think it's been pretty successful so far. Then we're getting down to the nitty-gritty about territorial ambitions and, of course, what Ukraine's long-term future looks like, because nobody is saying they're going to be in NATO for real.
And it depends how much Trump wants to get involved in this, doesn't this, Nick? I mean, if he decides that it's just not something that he wants to sort of turn his hand to, unless he gets a sniff of something that could bring him a sense of victory. It is arguably now Europe's war to sort out. It
is, and it will be, and it will remain so. I think Trump will wash his hands of it in many ways. And you remember he said he was going to normalise relations between the West and North Korea. He had 3 meetings and it didn't work out. I mean, he's very good at saying things, but actually very difficult to deliver. I think we're in for a miserable period. You've got to remember that much of Ukraine has been smashed by missiles, and we're sitting here in a warm studio in central London. But many people in Ukraine aren't even living in their own homes, and if they are, or they've got a job to go to, they don't have power and they don't have water. This is about a country which has been torn apart, and Putin has no interest. I think one final point, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State outgoing, gave an interview, in fact, over lunch to the FT a few days ago, in which he said the Chinese had pulled Russia back from the use of nuclear weapons. Now, that's the first time I've heard that, and that is symptomatic of how determined Putin has been and how he is prepared to go for broke in his own mind, which is about seizing Ukraine or destroying it as a Western power.
You're listening to the Monocle Daily with me, Emma Nelson, Latika Book and Nick Gowing. Now, last week it was the article in Die Welt offering support for the far-right Alternative für Deutschland. This week, the world's richest man and chief Trump whisperer, Elon Musk, has been offering running commentaries on British politics. First, there's been comments about an historical scandal involving grooming gangs, and more recently, he's turned his fire on the leader of the Populist Party Reform, Nigel Farage. Here's what the UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer had to say about it all earlier today.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims, they're interested in themselves.
That was the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer having some pretty scathing words about Elon Musk. Latika, in the office before we came on air, I half-jokingly suggested that Elon Musk is the next US president. He certainly behaves like one, doesn't he?
I think he behaves exactly like Trump behaved in Trump 1.0. In fact, Trump 2.0's tweets now look rather cogent and considered compared to Elon Musk, who's taken over as the freewheeling, hyperactive, multi-posting tweets all day. I don't know how Elon Musk is running all his companies, because he seems to spend an awful lot of time on Twitter telling everybody else how to do their jobs. One thing I do note, Emma, he cites his business interests in Germany as a reason for wading into German elections and backing the far-right AfD. He has very little to say, this free speech absolutist, about censorship in another country where he has considerable business interests. That's China.
Nick, just listening to what... Well, just sort of trying to grasp the speed at which Elon Musk has suddenly popped up in European politics in less than a fortnight. It is absolutely staggering, and it was prompted by this article he wrote in Die Welt. And is that newspaper in Germany beginning to regret offering, offering Musk the platform? It is so tempting, isn't it, when you are offered someone who is close to power, as close to power as Elon Musk is, and you are given a scoop. Of course you want to hear what he wants to say. But the fact that half of the editorial staff disagreed with it, one senior member resigned, they knew that the minute you start to allow Elon Musk that platform, a door can never be closed again.
I think Musk is a very sinister force. And when you look at him with Trump talks about him as Elon, and almost treats him as a god. Someone I was talking to the other day suggested that Elon will be in and out within a year. But in many ways, he's becoming an international autocrat, where anything he writes, even if it's ill-informed, but if it's opinionated and he puts it on X, he knows he's going to get enormous resonance. And that, I think, is what is incredibly sinister about what is happening, whether it be to Keir Starmer here in the UK, or whether it be to Nigel Farage. Musk having potentially offered up to $100 million, according to the Sunday Times about a month ago, to reform, to back Farage. Now he's saying Farage isn't up to it. Let's go for someone else, Rupert. So I think he's very sinister. He seems to have an opinion about most things. My goodness, he has a vast amounts of cash. There are times I wonder whether, and I've got to be careful about how I say this, whether there's a Ponzi scheme about what he's doing, because there's so much cash wrapping around here and going around the world with space and Starlink and so on. You wonder where all the money's coming from, but he seems to have enormous power. And the worst thing is he's radicalizing extremism.
And that poor values-based traditional system that so many European countries adhere to seems totally incapable of resisting this. Or there are so few checks and balances that exist within the traditional political infrastructure that can cope with someone as such a whirlwind.
So far, Emma. And I think that's really the nail on the head here, because I feel like Elon is accelerating, I think, what will be a very considered and hefty response to tech in a way we yet haven't seen. You can feel the gathering storm of backlash against the way tech companies have driven and polarised societies. Some of it is not even intentional as such, but you can see it with the way the Americans are reacting to TikTok. You can see it the way the Europeans are reacting to TikTok as well. Meta, of course, has already been right through this and hates dealing with political content and news on its platforms for this reason and downgrades it. Now, X has gone in completely on the side of the far right under Elon Musk. And I don't think it's going to be tolerated or accepted for that long. And I think you will start to see now just a heady gathering of steam from world leaders saying, hang about, maybe we need to redefine exactly what sort of speech goes on these platforms after all.
Is the ground strong enough, though, Nick? When you look at what's happening in Europe now, when we have an election in February in Germany where there is no coherent government, the last government has failed. You have Alternative für Deutschland within striking distance of significant power, and Elon Musk talking to the leader on X. In France, you have had Marine Le Pen by a hair's breadth, not getting into power a couple of years ago, but huge amounts of power within grasp in France. In Austria, we have the possibility of the far-right Freedom Party taking power in the government. And even if Elon Musk is gone within a year, there is a potential that the head of steam that could be built up could be profoundly changing for the European political climate.
But Emma, that's why I said right at the beginning I find him sinister. But he's popularising populism, and he's enforcing. He's giving power. He's giving self-confidence to the forces who want to do things in a very different way, who are also disillusioned with the democratic process, even if the democratic process is going to give them more power. And Musk seems to be fueling that. And that's why I find it sinister that someone like that can have so much power that one tweet on X, and maybe I'll be banned from it after what I said a bit earlier, a tweet on X can actually have so much resonance so quickly in so many areas.
I also think it will accelerate a massive turn-off, though. I think we're getting to a point where, and I've seen this with people in my own age bracket, just turning off social media, turning out of news, which obviously you and I would despair at, Emma. But
I don't know what you mean.
But I do think this is all going to accelerate some of the forces that are there. Yes, populism is there. Elon is accelerating it, but Elon is not the only populist around, let's be clear. These forces have been underway for some time. And so I think it would be very helpful too when we talk about this to also acknowledge there are very valid reasons why populists are selling a very saleable message at the moment.
Thank you for that. Right, let's turn to issues of if anybody's heard anyone develop a cough on air in the last few days, it may be because of the increasing levels of pollution, because anyone who's been in a car in London will know that you're better off on public transport. The UK capital is the most congested in Europe, with drivers in London now spending an average of 101 hours that you won't get back sitting in traffic. And it is the fourth year in a row that the city has scooped this less than enviable prize. Nick, how long do you spend in a car in London?
No, zero. Almost zero. As a matter of principle, I try and make public transport work, and it works well. Okay, there can be moments when you're pretty fed up with what can happen, but I think this is a report which is slightly mysterious, because in the end, if you want to drive in London, you're mad. You're going to spend a lot of money on the ULEZ scheme. You're going to spend a lot of money on the congestion charge, and you can keep complaining and sitting in traffic jams. And I don't have a white van. I don't have to. I'm not a builder, and therefore I don't have to bring tools into central London for a building site and so on. But on the other hand, I think you're mad if you need to rely on four wheels, which you are driving or a passenger in. I don't actually use many taxis, and when I do get on a taxi, I say, are you an EV?
You may as well burn money if you get in a taxi.
You will, because you'll sit around being congested. I've proven many times it's much quicker to walk or take a bike. Or take an electric bike, which you can hire. There are many standing there, vast rows of them, and it costs very small amounts of money. So I think many people need to change the way they travel.
We have to spare a thought for poor old London, which has evolved in an incredibly piecemeal way since the Bronze Age. And I remember someone telling me, "Wake me up when London's finished."
No.
But the fact is, that because every bit is sort of been bolted on as we've grown and grown and grown. When you get cities this size, it is incredibly difficult to actually create a transport infrastructure that actually functions, because things change from street to street.
I think you're being a bit fashionable in terms of doing down London here. You know, again, almost as an experiment, a prolonged experiment, I've made sure that my car actually stays in the garage to the point where I'm saying, why do I need a car anymore? Because actually, in order to get here, I take a tube. I come here on public transport. So why do I need to have a car if a car is going to be more inefficient?
Latika, lover of big cities, lover of London.
I do love London. And I think public transport in London is one of its best assets. But I actually try and use it as least as I can, because I try and walk everywhere. But today it was too cold, I must admit, so I did catch tube. But I'm actually very surprised by this finding, because having spent time in Jakarta, where literally you can only schedule 1 or 2 meetings per day in Jakarta, and also New York. I mean, New York is just horrific in terms of traffic. But I do think, honestly, sometimes it can be faster to walk in London than it can be to drive. So
New York's introducing a congestion charge today. But I was in New York for the Climate Week back in September, and I had a wonderful time on the subway and buses. And my credit card or cash card came through time after time with $2.37 for a single fixed fare, and I got around much quicker than on four wheels.
That is very good. I must say, I do set myself a contest whenever I travel anywhere now to see how easy and affordable it is to use the public transport. Yep. Now, if I can work it out in about 5 minutes with my suitcases in my hand, with my phone in the other hand fumbling away, I will use the public transport. If it takes me longer than that and it's unintelligible to me, then I will grab an Uber. But I was recently in Estonia. I would say it was.
Oh, now that
Tallinn was one of the
wildly brilliant,
best places I have been for this.
When you fall out of the airport onto a tram.
Yeah, I mean, it was just so easy and everything was so clear and the signs were very easy to understand, all in a different language, but just so clear. Tallinn is a dream of organisation and preparedness. I wish the Estonians ran the world of infrastructure.
Lessons from Latika. Thank you both for that. Now, close to a decade now since David Cameron called on the British people to vote Leave or Remain in 2016, the word Brexit still continues to rear its head into nearly every political debate in the United Kingdom. Well, a steadfast chronicler of Brexit, its orchestrators and its upending of British politics is Tim Shipman. His Brexit series includes All Out War, Fallout, No Way Out, and the recently released final instalment, Out. Monocle's Andrew Muller sat down with Shipman a little bit earlier and began by asking what the UK would look like if Boris Johnson hadn't turned his career to politics.
I think it's pretty different. I mean, I think there's a pretty good case you can make that we might not have left the EU in the first place. And I certainly don't think the course of Brexit would have been quite the same. If he had not imploded in 2016 and taken the job then, I think it would have looked a bit different. Similarly, if he hadn't become Prime Minister and succumbed to the contradictions of his own personality, and he might well still be there. So I think, there's a good case to be made. If he'd become Prime Minister in 2016, he would have, as the sort of king Brexiteer, would have been able to compromise a bit, sell a more moderate Brexit to Brexiteers in the country and in his own party, or alternatively ended up broadly where he did years later, but without the 2.5 years of misery where Theresa May and Parliament kind of went head to head on the whole issue. And I think we would have ended up in a similar place, but much quicker and with less pain. So I think that's the big kind of what if. But fundamentally, Brexit happened because Johnson and Gove were both prepared to support it, and they were both prepared to support Dominic Cummings running the campaign. And between the three of them, they won it. It's quite hard to see it happening, certainly without Johnson.
Because the book is so detailed, it does remind you quite minutely, often sentence by sentence, minute by minute, how often politics hinges on almost whimsical decisions made by particular people at a particular time, and how they interact with the other almost whimsical decisions made by other particular people at a particular time. Amid all that, did it strike you that it was actually, that there were moments when Brexit might not actually have happened, that it might never have got done?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of 2018 and 2019, there was a majority in the House of Commons for either a soft Brexit or to go at some point to a referendum. They never quite got the numbers for a referendum, but the people who supported a softer version of Brexit were in a considerable majority in the House, and they never quite got their acts together to vote for one particular solution. And in the end, that allowed Johnson and the hardline Brexiteers who by then were supporting him to sort of take things on and ram things through in a much more aggressive way. And, they said they were backing, the will of the people, and they were able to make that argument, and they did it in such a way that in 2019 he won a big majority. But certainly before that, while Theresa May was Prime Minister, it's another interesting what if. What if the Labour front bench, who fundamentally wanted to talk about class issues rather than about Brexit, had supported her deal, got Brexit done, and then started arguing about, how you run the country rather than where the country is positioned internationally. Similarly, those sort of Remainers and soft Brexiteers in the Conservative Party could equally well have jumped ship, and in the end they did try and tie Boris Johnson's hands. They did vote for a thing called the Ben Act, which was designed to stop him leaving without a deal, but they never quite got together for anything positive or to really kind of derail him and bring him down, and ultimately he was able to push through all that.
I mean, the book is, we should make clear to listeners, impeccably well sourced. You appear to have spoken to pretty much everybody who was involved with this bizarre period of British politics. When you talk to people about that now, how do they reflect on it? Are there still a lot of thousand-yard stares?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. I mean, there's some people who haven't read any of my books despite contributing to all of them because they still find it too traumatic. There are some people who wouldn't read the first one who worked for David Cameron who are now enjoying the fourth one about Boris Johnson and Liz Truss's travails. So there's a bit of kind of internal Tory party schadenfreude going on there. Most of them, fortunately took the view that it was worth trying to get, the first draft of history right, and were keen that their account of events was just as prominent as everybody else's. So, there's partly people with a benevolent view of history, and there's people with a view that they need to make sure that they don't get shafted. So those two things come together and gave me the access I needed.
Obviously, to write a book book of this length and in this much detail, you're mired fairly deep in the political culture of the time, and I'm just wondering if you ever found yourself sort of despairing of it. My eye was drawn to a line you attribute to an unnamed female MP, and I suspect you put it in the book for a reason. She describes it as, and I quote, blokes, blokes, blokes being twats, twats, twats.
Yeah, that's one of my favourite quotes in the book. That was actually referring to the People's Vote campaign, which was trying to get a referendum and ultimately to overturn the result.
This is a bipartisan criticism, though,
I think it's perfectly fair criticism of quite a lot of it. There was a lot of ego. There were lots of people who, in trying to resolve the problem, wanted a bill with their name on it or an initiative with their name on it. You know, we had Malthouse compromises and Ben Acts and all the rest of it. Everybody wanted their name on an amendment, and ultimately they didn't really get themselves particularly well organised. I think even as we were in it, journalists who were sort of realising that this was probably going to be the high point of political chaos in their working lifetimes and were kind of enjoying the fact that there was so much turbulence were still at various points looking on it with utter despair. I think certainly that first half of 2019 where Parliament seemed completely incapable of coming to a solution, and most people at that point who were close to it had long since past caring what the solution was. They just wanted people to find one.
Final question related to the question we started with, and it is about the central character in this curious period of British politics, i.e. Boris Johnson. Do you think we've seen the last of him?
Well, he doesn't think we've seen the last of him, and if he doesn't, then there's every chance that we haven't. Look, Boris Johnson is regarded by most people in the Conservative Party as out for himself, self-centred, not really a party man, someone who will do his own thing. But when the Tories got 9% in the European elections in 2019, they all went, hang on a minute, there's this fellow who's won 4 national elections. We haven't got much choice but to hand the whole train set over to him. What followed was good and bad in ways that were wholly predictable for anyone who's paid any attention to Boris Johnson. It was no great surprise that his premiership came unstuck because of a failure to tell the truth in a chaotic sort of centre of government. But the Tories, have just been absolutely hammered at the general election. The Reform Party is gearing up big time. You can imagine a world in which they do very well in the local elections this year. They're targeting winning a lot of seats in the Welsh Assembly next year, and if that happens, the Conservative Party is probably going to have an aneurysm, and there's every chance that Kemi Badenoch is not the person who takes them into the next general election. And if that's the case, I would have thought the two most likely people to do it instead are James Cleverly, who looked like he was sort of winning the Tory contest until some strange things happened towards the end of it, and the blonde bombshell over the water. And people say, oh, well, could he possibly get a seat? Could he possibly become an MP again? Could he possibly lead the party? And I think, on balance, it's unlikely. But if it is regarded by the Conservative Party as necessary, then what is unlikely becomes almost inevitable. And I would think, there is a decent coin flip chance that we see him again in some capacity.
Tim Shipman there talking to Monocle's Andrew Muller. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of the Monocle Daily. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, Tyler Brûlé, Thomas Lewis, Latika Book and Nick Gowing. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. And our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Emma Nelson here in London. The Monocle Daily's back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great week.